The bells on Pip's cap jingled softly as he crept through the shadowed corridors of Ravenhollow Castle, their merry sound a stark contrast to the screams echoing from the throne room below. King Aldrich the Mad was holding court again, and another lord had displeased him. The smell of burning flesh drifted up through the stone floors, carried by draughts that seemed to whisper of death and madness. Pip pressed himself against the cold wall, counting the heartbeats until silence returned. 7 screams. The king's rage was particularly fierce today. He would need to be exceptionally careful when he performed tonight. At 19, Pip had survived 3 years as court jester to the most dangerous man in the 7 kingdoms. Where others saw only a fool in motley, dancing and singing for scraps, Pip understood the delicate art of staying alive in a court where a wrong word could mean death, and the right one might buy him another day. The heavy oak door to his small chamber groaned as he pushed it open. The room was sparse: a straw mattress, a cracked wash basin, and a trunk containing his few possessions. But hidden beneath a loose stone in the corner lay his most precious treasure, a collection of letters and observations he had gathered over the years. Information was the only currency that mattered in Ravenhollow, and Pip had learned to hoard it like a miser hoards gold. He pulled out a torn piece of parchment and added today's notation. King burned Lord Garrett alive for suggesting the realm's coffers grow thin. Queen Seraphina watched without expression. Prince Marcus absent from court for 4th consecutive day. A soft knock interrupted his writing. Pip quickly hid the parchment and opened the door to find Mira, one of the kitchen maids. Her face was pale, eyes wide with fear. "The king calls for you," she whispered. "He wants entertainment before the evening feast." Pip's stomach clenched, but he forced a grin. "Then, entertainment he shall have, sweet Mira. Tell me, what manner of mood grips our beloved sovereign today?" "Dark as a winter storm," she replied, wringing her hands. "He's been drinking since dawn, and the queen has not left her chambers. There are whispers." "Whispers are dangerous things in these halls," Pip said gently, though his mind raced to fill in what she dared not say. The queen had been growing distant from the king, and rumors of her correspondence with lords from neighboring kingdoms had begun to circulate among the servants. Mira nodded and hurried away. Pip gathered his loot, checked that his juggling balls were secure in his belt pouch, and made his way toward the throne room. Each step required careful consideration. Too eager, and the king might suspect him of some ulterior motive. Too reluctant, and he would be seen as ungrateful for the king's patronage. The throne room of Ravenhollow was a testament to both grandeur and madness. Soaring stone arches supported a vaulted ceiling painted with scenes of conquest and glory, but the beauty was marred by the iron cages hanging from the rafters, some still occupied by the slowly dying remains of those who had displeased the king. The throne itself was carved from black marble, inlaid with veins of silver that caught the torchlight like frozen lightning. King Aldrich slouched upon his throne, wine goblet in hand, his once golden hair now streaked with premature gray. His eyes, a pale blue that had once been compared to summer skies, now held the unpredictable fury of a storm at sea. He was only 32, but madness had aged him beyond his years. "Ah, my faithful fool," the king called out as Pip approached. "Come, entertain us. We have need of laughter on this dreary day." Pip bowed low, bells chiming. "Your Majesty honors me. What manner of mirth would please the crown today?" "Tell us a tale," the king commanded, leaning forward. "A tale of loyalty and betrayal, of those who serve their king faithfully, and those who—" His voice trailed off, but his eyes glittered with dangerous intent. Pip's mind worked quickly. The king was clearly thinking of someone specific, someone he suspected of disloyalty. The queen's absence, the prince's continued avoidance of court, the whispers Mira had mentioned. He needed to tell a story that would satisfy the king's paranoia without condemning any particular person. "I know just the tale, Your Majesty," Pip said, settling cross-legged on the floor before the throne. "It is the story of the wise king and the 3 servants." He began to weave his tale, watching the king's expression carefully. The story told of a king who had 3 servants, one who flattered him constantly, one who remained silent and distant, and one who dared to speak truth when asked. The first servant, Pip explained with exaggerated gestures, told the king only what he wished to hear, even when the kingdom faced genuine threats. The second avoided the king entirely, claiming to serve him best by managing affairs from afar. But the third servant, though sometimes bearing uncomfortable news, proved most loyal when enemies approached the gates. As Pip spoke, He wove in subtle observations about the nature of loyalty, the difference between those who loved the king and those who loved what the king could give them. He watched King Aldrich's face, noting which parts of the tale made him nod approvingly and which made his grip tighten on his goblet. "And which servant proved most valuable to the king?" Aldrich asked when the tale concluded. "Why, the one who spoke truth, your majesty," Pip replied. "For flattery may soothe the ear, and distance may seem like discretion, but only truth serves the crown when danger approaches." The king was quiet for a long moment, studying Pip with those unsettling eyes. Finally he smiled, though it never reached his eyes. "Wise words from a fool. Tell me, Pip, what truths do you see in our court?" This was the moment Pip had both dreaded and prepared for. The king was testing him, wanting to know if his jester had observed anything useful. But it was also an opportunity to plant seeds of information that might serve him later. "I see much, your majesty, but I am only a fool. Perhaps I misunderstand what I observe." Pip kept his voice light, self-deprecating. "I see servants who work hard to serve the crown, though some seem burdened by heavy thoughts. I see lords who smile in your presence but whisper in corridors, though I know not what they discuss. And I see a king wise enough to seek truth from even the lowliest of his subjects." "These lords who whisper," the king said, leaning forward. "What is the nature of their whispers?" Pip pretended to consider this carefully. "I fear I understand little of politics, your majesty, but they seem concerned about the realm's borders, about harvests and trade. Boring matters that would surely put your majesty to sleep if spoken aloud." This was carefully calculated truth. The lords were indeed discussing these matters, but they were also discussing much more dangerous topics. By mentioning only the innocent concerns, Pip could appear forthcoming, while protecting himself from accusations of eavesdropping on treasonous conversations. King Aldrich nodded slowly. "And what of our queen? What have you observed of her recent disposition?" Here was the real trap. Pip had indeed observed much about Queen Seraphina's recent behavior. Her secret meetings with the maester, her correspondence with her brother in the eastern kingdoms, her increasingly frequent visits to the sept. But revealing too much would make him appear as a spy, while revealing too little might anger the king. "Her majesty seems devout of late, your majesty. She spends much time in prayer. Perhaps the weight of queenship grows heavy, and she seeks solace in the gods." "Prayer," the king mused. "Yes, perhaps prayer is what she seeks." But his tone suggested he suspected otherwise. A commotion at the hall's entrance interrupted the conversation. Prince Marcus entered, flanked by 2 guards. He was tall like his father, but had inherited his mother's dark hair and gentle eyes. At 16, he showed promise as both warrior and scholar, but he had grown increasingly uncomfortable with his father's brutal rule. "Father," Marcus said, approaching the throne with careful respect, "I have returned from inspecting the northern fortifications as you commanded." "Ah, my son returns," King Aldrich said, though his tone carried little warmth. "Tell us, what did you find at our borders?" Marcus glanced briefly at Pip, who caught the look and understood its meaning. The prince had indeed been inspecting fortifications, but he had also been meeting with northern lords, gauging their loyalty and discussing their concerns about the king's increasingly erratic behavior. "The fortifications are strong, father. The men are well-trained and loyal. However, there are concerns about supply lines should winter prove harsh." "Concerns," the king repeated. "Always concerns. Do these lords not trust their king to provide for them?" "They trust in your wisdom, father. They simply wished to be prepared." Pip watched this exchange carefully. Father and son were speaking 2 different languages, one of suspicion and paranoia, the other of genuine concern for the realm. Neither quite understood the other, and the gap between them was widening. "Play us something cheerful, fool," the king commanded suddenly. "All this talk of concerns and preparations grows tedious." Pip took up his lute and began a popular ballad about brave knights and fair maidens, one with enough ribald humor to amuse the king, but nothing that could be considered offensive. As he played, he observed the dynamics in the room. The king drank steadily, his mood growing more unpredictable with each cup. Prince Marcus remained tense, clearly uncomfortable with his father's state. Several courtiers had entered during the performance, and Pip noted which ones positioned themselves closer to the prince rather than the king. The song ended, and King Aldrich called for another, then another. As the afternoon wore on, the king's demands became more erratic. He wanted juggling, then riddles, then jokes that grew increasingly cruel in nature. Pip obliged each request, but he could feel the tension building in the room like pressure before a storm. Finally, as evening approached, Queen Seraphina entered the hall. She was still beautiful at 28, with the refined features and graceful bearing that had made her a prized marriage alliance 15 years ago. But the years with Aldrich had etched lines of worry around her eyes, and she moved with the careful precision of someone always aware of potential danger. "My king," she said, curtsying before the throne, "I hope I am not interrupting." "Never, my dear," Aldrich replied, though his smile was predatory. "We were just enjoying the fool's entertainment. Perhaps you would like to hear his wisdom." "I would be honored," Seraphina replied, taking her place on the smaller throne beside her husband. Pip found himself in an impossible position. The king clearly suspected his wife of something, and he was using Pip as a tool to probe those suspicions. Whatever he said now could have deadly consequences for the queen, the prince, or himself. "Your Majesty is too kind," Pip said. "I am but a simple fool with simple observations. Perhaps a song would better serve the evening." "Nonsense," the king insisted. "Share your wisdom about loyalty, fool. Tell us about the nature of marriage vows." The request was loaded with threat. Pip saw Queen Seraphina's hands tighten in her lap, noticed Prince Marcus shift uncomfortably. The courtiers grew very still, sensing the danger in the air. "Marriage vows," Pip mused aloud, as if considering the topic for the first time. "A fascinating subject, Your Majesty. I have observed that the strongest marriages are like the best swords, forged in fire and cooled in patience. They require both strength and flexibility to endure." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "I have seen that when one partner suspects the other without cause, the suspicion itself becomes like rust on the blade, weakening what was once strong. But when partners trust and communicate openly, their bond becomes unbreakable." "And what of marriages where one partner keeps secrets?" the king pressed. "Ah," Pip said, nodding sagely. "I have observed that there are different types of secrets, Your Majesty. Some secrets are kept from shame or fear, like a wife who hides the cost of a new gown. Others are kept from love, like a husband who hides his plans for a surprise gift. And still others are kept from wisdom, like parents who shield their children from worries that would only cause unnecessary fear." He looked directly at the king. "The wise ruler, I think, learns to distinguish between secrets that threaten and secrets that protect." King Aldrich studied Pip for a long moment, then turned to his wife. "And what think you of the fool's wisdom, my queen?" "I think," Seraphina said carefully, "that wisdom can come from unexpected sources, and that trust, once broken, is difficult to repair, but trust maintained grows stronger with time." The king's expression was unreadable. Finally, he laughed, though the sound held no genuine mirth. "Philosophy from fools and queens. How entertaining." He stood abruptly. "We grow weary of entertainment. Guards, escort our queen to her chambers. We would speak with our son privately." As the queen was led away, she caught Pip's eye for just a moment. In that brief glance, he saw both gratitude and warning. He had navigated this particular trap successfully, but the danger was far from over. "Leave us," the king commanded the courtiers. "All except the fool. You remain." When the hall had emptied except for the three of them and a handful of guards, King Aldrich descended from his throne and began pacing. The wine had made him unsteady, but his mind remained sharp and dangerous. "Tell me, son," he said to Marcus, "what do you truly think of your father's rule?" Marcus straightened. "I think you are a strong king facing difficult times, father. The realm is vast, the challenges many." "Diplomatic words," Aldrich replied. "But I asked what you truly think." Pip watched this exchange with growing alarm. The king was pushing his son towards some kind of confrontation, and Marcus was too honest for his own good. "I think," Marcus said slowly, "that strength and wisdom must work together, that a king's power is most secure when his people trust him, not just fear him." "Trust," the king repeated, "like the trust I should have in my wife? In my son? In my lords?" "Yes, father. And the trust they should have in you." King Aldrich stopped pacing and stared at his son. "And if that trust has been betrayed, what then?" "Then it must be rebuilt, if possible. Or—" Marcus hesitated. "Or what?" "Or consequences must follow, but only after truth has been established, not suspicion." The king turned to Pip. "What say you, fool? Should a king act on suspicion, or wait for proof?" This was perhaps the most dangerous question yet. Pip understood that the king was not really asking for advice. He was testing loyalties and looking for justification for actions he had already decided to take. "Your Majesty," Pip said carefully, "I have observed that suspicion is like a poison. A little makes one cautious and wise. Too much makes one sick and reckless. The wise king, I think, gathers information before acting, but does not wait so long that real enemies grow strong." "Wise words," the king mused. "And how does one gather information?" "Carefully, Your Majesty. Through trusted sources, by listening more than speaking, by watching what people do when they think no one is observing." King Aldrich smiled, and this time it was genuinely pleased. "Yes, exactly so. And what have you observed, my faithful fool, about the loyalty of those around me?" Here it was, the moment Pip had been dreading. The king was asking him to become an informant, to betray the trust of everyone in the castle in exchange for royal favor. But refusing would be seen as suspicious, while agreeing would make him complicit in whatever the king was planning. "I observe much, Your Majesty, but I am uncertain how to interpret what I see. Perhaps if you shared your specific concerns, I could offer more useful observations." The king considered this. "Very well. I suspect my queen maintains correspondence with her brother in the eastern kingdoms. I suspect certain lords are more loyal to my son than to me. I suspect there are those who would see me removed from the throne." Each accusation was delivered with increasing intensity. Pip realized that the king's paranoia had reached dangerous levels, and that he was being recruited as a spy to confirm suspicions that might or might not have basis in reality. "Your Majesty's concerns are understandable," Pip said. "A king must be vigilant. However, I am but a fool, skilled only in entertainment. Perhaps these matters would be better investigated by those with proper training in such things." "The maester serves the queen as much as me," the king said dismissively. "The captain of guards is too obvious. The spymaster died of sudden illness last month." This last was said with particular significance. Everyone knew the spymaster had been executed for delivering unwelcome news. "But a fool," the king continued, "goes everywhere, sees everything, and is noticed by no one. Who would suspect the jester of being anything more than he appears?" Prince Marcus had been listening to this conversation with growing alarm. "Father, surely you don't mean to turn the fool into a spy? That would be beneath the dignity of the crown." "Dignity?" The king's voice rose. "I speak of survival, boy, of protecting the realm from those who would destroy it from within." "And I speak of justice," Marcus replied, his own voice rising to match his father's, "of not condemning people based on suspicion and fear." Father and son faced each other across the empty throne room, years of growing tension finally erupting into open conflict. Pip found himself caught between them, and he realized that whatever happened next would determine not just his own fate, but possibly the fate of the entire kingdom. "You dare lecture me about justice?" the king snarled. "You who have been meeting with northern lords behind my back. You who have been encouraging them to question my decisions? I have been serving the realm, father, listening to their concerns, helping them understand your policies, maintaining their loyalty through dialogue rather than fear." "Their loyalty should not require maintenance," the king roared. "I am their king. Their loyalty should be absolute." "Loyalty cannot be absolute without trust," Marcus shot back. "And trust cannot exist without honesty and justice." The king's hand moved to the sword at his side, and Pip saw with horror that the confrontation was escalating beyond words. Prince Marcus saw it too, and his own hand moved instinctively toward his weapon. "Stop!" Pip cried out, leaping between them. "Your Majesty, Prince Marcus, please!" Both men turned to him, startled by the fool's sudden intervention. "Forgive me," Pip said quickly, "but I cannot bear to see this conflict between two people I serve. Perhaps there is wisdom to be found in an old tale?" Without waiting for permission, he began to speak rapidly. There was once a king who had a magic mirror that showed him the future. He saw that his kingdom would face great troubles, and in his fear, he began to suspect everyone around him of treachery. The more he watched the mirror, the more dangers he saw, until he could trust no one. Pip moved between father and son as he spoke, his voice carrying clearly through the hall. Meanwhile, his son saw the same troubles approaching, and tried to prepare the kingdom by strengthening alliances and addressing the people's concerns. But when the king saw his son's activities in the magic mirror, they appeared as betrayal rather than loyalty. He paused, looking at both men. The tragedy was that father and son were fighting the same battles, serving the same kingdom, but from different directions. Their conflict weakened them both at the moment when they most needed to be united. King Aldrich's hand slowly moved away from his sword. "And how did this tale end, fool?" That depends, Your Majesty, on which version you prefer. In one ending, the king destroys the mirror and learns to trust his eyes and heart rather than his fears. In another, the mirror's prophecies come true because the king's suspicions create the very betrayals he feared. The king was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was tired rather than angry. Perhaps we have spoken enough truth for one evening. Guards, escort my son to his chambers. We will continue this discussion when cooler heads prevail. As Marcus was led away, he looked back at Pip with something like gratitude. The fool had prevented what could have been a fatal confrontation, at least for now. When they were alone except for the guards, King Aldrich slumped back onto his throne. Tell me honestly, fool. Do you think me mad? It was perhaps the most dangerous question the king had ever asked him. Pip considered his answer carefully. I think, Your Majesty, that kingship is the loneliest burden any man can bear. I think that when one carries the weight of an entire kingdom, the mind seeks patterns and threats everywhere, even where none exist. I think wisdom lies in distinguishing between real dangers and imagined ones. And which category do my current suspicions fall into? Some of each, I suspect, Your Majesty. There are always those who would harm a king, but perhaps not as many as fear suggests. And there are always those who love and serve faithfully, but perhaps not in the ways that are most visible. The king studied him. You speak carefully, fool, but you have not answered my question about serving as my eyes and ears. Pip knew he could no longer evade this demand. If Your Majesty commands it, I will serve. But I would ask one thing in return. You bargain with your king? I ask for wisdom, Your Majesty. Tell me what information would actually serve you, rather than what might simply confirm existing suspicions. A fool who reports everything sees nothing clearly. King Aldrich laughed, and for a moment he sounded almost normal. Clever fool. Very well. I want to know if my queen corresponds with foreign powers about matters of state. I want to know if any lords are planning active rebellion. I want to know if my son seeks to claim the throne before his time. These were specific, actionable concerns rather than vague paranoia. Pip nodded. I understand, Your Majesty. And if I discover that any of these fears are unfounded, then I will be relieved to hear it. Contrary to what some believe, I take no pleasure in finding enemies where friends should be. Over the following weeks, Pip began his double life in earnest. By day, he continued his duties as court fool, entertaining the king and queen, performing for nobles and servants alike. But he also began to pay closer attention to the subtle currents of castle life. He discovered that Queen Seraphina did indeed correspond with her brother, but the letters concerned family matters and trade agreements that would benefit the realm. Her increased devotion was genuine. She had been praying for guidance on how to help her increasingly unstable husband without endangering their son. Prince Marcus was meeting with northern lords, but not to plan rebellion. He was genuinely trying to maintain their loyalty by addressing their concerns and representing their interests to the king. Many of the lords were indeed worried about the king's mental state, but they remained loyal to the crown itself. The real danger, Pip discovered, came from an unexpected source. Lord Caspar, the king's treasurer, had been embezzling from the royal coffers for years. Worse, he had been spreading rumors about the queen's supposed foreign correspondence to deflect attention from his own crimes. Several other courtiers were involved in the scheme, and they had been encouraging the king's paranoia to keep suspicion away from themselves. Pip found himself in possession of information that could save the innocent but would require him to expose a conspiracy that reached deep into the court's power structure. The conspirators were dangerous men who would not hesitate to kill to protect their secret. He spent several sleepless nights considering his options. He could report everything to the king, but Aldrich's current mental state made him as likely to kill the messenger as to investigate the message. He could approach Prince Marcus, but involving the prince could be seen as treason by the king. He could try to gather more evidence, but the longer he waited, the more danger everyone faced. Finally, he decided on a calculated risk. He would use his position as fool to reveal the truth gradually, through stories and performances that would guide the king toward discovering the conspiracy himself. His opportunity came during a feast celebrating the harvest. The great hall was filled with nobles, and the king was in unusually good spirits. Pip was called upon to provide entertainment, and he chose to perform a series of riddles about hidden treasures and false friends. I know a riddle about a man who found gold, he announced to the assembled crowd. This man was trusted to guard his master's treasure, but he decided the gold would serve better in his own purse. To hide his crime, he convinced his master that the servants were stealing, and soon the master trusted no one. What became of the man? The crowd offered various answers, but Pip shook his head at each one. The man grew rich, while his master grew poor and friendless. But gold stolen in darkness has a way of glinting in sunlight, and eventually the master saw the truth. He moved on to other riddles, but he noticed several courtiers shifting uncomfortably. Lord Caspar, in particular, had grown pale. Over the following days, Pip continued this strategy. He told stories about treasurers who became thieves, about loyal servants falsely accused, about the difference between real and manufactured evidence. He performed these tales publicly, as entertainment, but he made sure the king heard every word. Gradually, King Aldrich began to ask questions. Why were the coffers lower than expected? Who had access to the royal treasury? Why had suspicions about the queen emerged only after certain lords joined the court? The investigation that followed revealed the extent of the conspiracy. Lord Caspar and his accomplices had stolen thousands of gold pieces over several years. They had systematically undermined trust in the royal family to prevent scrutiny of their own activities. The evidence was overwhelming once someone looked for it. The executions were swift and public. But more importantly, the revelation of the real conspiracy helped restore the king's faith in his family. Queen Seraphina's correspondence was revealed to be innocent. Prince Marcus's meetings with the lords were shown to be loyal service. And the king began to see how his paranoia had been manipulated by those with true treacherous intent. The crisis passed, but its effects lingered. King Aldrich remained unstable, his madness merely redirected rather than cured. However, he had learned to distinguish between his own fears and external manipulation. Queen Seraphina and Prince Marcus worked together to help manage his condition, and the kingdom found a fragile stability. Pip's role evolved as well. He remained the court fool, but he had also become an unofficial advisor, someone the royal family could trust to see clearly and speak honestly. It was still a dangerous position, requiring constant vigilance and careful judgment, but he had found a way to survive and even thrive in the treacherous waters of court politics. One evening, months after the conspiracy's exposure, Pip sat alone in his chamber, updating his hidden records. A soft knock interrupted his writing, and he opened the door to find Prince Marcus. "May I come in?" the prince asked. Pip gestured him inside, quickly hiding his papers. "Your Highness honors me. How may I serve you?" Marcus looked around the sparse room, then met Pip's eyes. "I wanted to thank you for what you did during those dark weeks. You saved more than just lives. You saved the kingdom from tearing itself apart. I am only a fool, Your Highness. I did what seemed necessary." "That's exactly why it worked," Marcus said. "Because you were willing to be seen as only a fool while actually being much more. Tell me, how did you know the truth about Lord Caspar and his conspiracy?" Pip considered how much to reveal. "I listened, Your Highness. I watched. I remembered things that others forgot. And I realized that the simplest explanation is often the correct one. Your father's fears were being fed by someone, but they were the wrong fears about the wrong people. Will you continue to serve my father as you have?" "As long as I am able, Your Highness. As long as I can do more good than harm." Marcus nodded. "When I am king someday, I hope you will serve me as well. The realm needs people who see clearly and speak truthfully, even when that truth is uncomfortable. The realm needs good kings, Your Highness. Kings who listen to truth, whether it comes from nobles or fools." After the prince left, Pip returned to his writing. He had survived another crisis, but he knew there would be others. King Aldrich's madness was contained, not cured. The kingdom faced external threats that would require unity and wisdom to overcome. And Pip himself had made enemies among those who preferred to operate in shadows and lies. But he had also learned something important about power and survival. The greatest strength often came not from appearing strong, but from being underestimated. The most valuable service was not always the most visible. And sometimes the wisdom of fools was the only wisdom that mattered. As he prepared for sleep, Pip could hear the night sounds of the castle around him. Guards changing shifts, servants finishing their duties, the distant sound of the king talking to himself in his chambers. It was the sound of a kingdom learning to live with madness, finding ways to function despite the chaos at its heart. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, new opportunities to serve or survive. But tonight, Pip allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. He had found his place in this dangerous world, carved out a role that let him use his intelligence to protect those who deserve protection and expose those who deserved exposure. The bells on his cap jingled softly as he settled onto his straw mattress, In the morning he would once again don the mask of the simple fool, dancing and singing for the amusement of his betters. But beneath that mask he would continue to watch, to listen, to remember, and when necessary, to act. For in a world where madness ruled and paranoia poisoned trust, sometimes the only wisdom to be found was in the words of fools, and the only safety lay in being too foolish to be feared, too entertaining to be dismissed, and too clever to be caught. The kingdom slept fitfully around him, but Pip smiled as he drifted off to sleep. He had learned the most important lesson of court survival. In a game where everyone else was playing for power, sometimes the winning move was to play for something else entirely. Truth, justice, protection of the innocent. These were prizes worth far more than gold or titles, and they were goals that could be pursued even by a humble fool with bells on his cap and wisdom in his heart. And so the story of Pip the Fool continued, one careful day at a time, in the shadow of the throne and the light of his own conscience, proving that sometimes the greatest courage was found not in wielding swords, but in wielding words, and that the truest nobility lay not in noble birth, but in noble purpose.